Afternoon, everyone. Hello, how are we doing? So, everything's going a little bit mental today, actually. We've got new political parties emerging, but those are my two videos for today. So, I thought we would discuss, I suppose, a crossover between US and UK politics because Donald Trump has managed to get his one big, beautiful bill passed, which, let me just show you some of the things on this because it is really quite spectacular. Um, this is a graphic from the BBC, but this is based on the congressional budget estimates. So, the result of Trump's bill, Bernie Sanders is basically describing it as, tens of thousands of Americans are going to die because Medicaid and food benefit is being removed in return for a tax break that will affect the richest. Because although in theory, some of the tax cuts would also affect ordinary Americans, as in benefit them, the vast majority of the benefit is for the richest. And this, you can talk about a parallel with this with Reform UK as well. Like I've discussed this before, but it's worth bringing up again. So Reform UK, I mean, they're openly right wing, right? They say that, but they have what will look like some left wing policies to try and convince the left wing voters. And one of them is raising the personal allowance to £20,000. So at the moment, the personal allowance is it's about 12,500. That is the first roughly £12,500 you earn. You don't pay any income tax on it. And so Farage had proposed raising it to 20,000, which sounds brilliant for people on low incomes, right? It sounds brilliant, yeah? Huge boost to them. It's not at all. It's a boost to the rich because what various economists point out is if you're on such a low income that you would notice a significant benefit from a policy like that, you'll get it taken away because you're probably on other benefits like universal credit. Because remember, even people in work are on universal credit. If you're on full-time national minimum wage, your salary at the moment is about £24,000 a year. So if you're on significantly lower than that, you're on quite a poor salary. So all that would happen for actually people on very low incomes is they would have some of their universal credit taken away. So it hardly benefits people on lower incomes at all. It does a little bit, but it's hardly anything, because most of the gains are just eaten up with losses of other benefits that they would no longer qualify for. But the rich would get it all. But there you go. Nova there saying, if you consider the falling value of the dollar, does it actually benefit the rich or just everyone? So the falling, yes, the dollar is actually, so when you, there's two things here. There's the value of the dollar. Falling, it depends, doesn't it? It makes imports more expensive. And because Trump has also made imports more expensive with his tariffs, it means that any people who need, because the assumption is always when you're putting tariffs on these, but it'll force them to buy American. Well, America doesn't produce enough of some things, and it doesn't produce anything of other things. So if you rely on imports, and remember, even for an American product, even if you're buying American, you might need imports. So for example, we talk about like cars as the classic example. A lot of the raw materials, it's not just components, but raw materials come from outside of the USA. They're now more expensive because of the lower value of the dollar. It helps exporters. So there is that side of it. But again, if the exporter needs to import raw materials first, it may not be a net benefit to them. But there's also when you talk about the dollar, the bond yields. So the bond yields are also lower than they were when Trump began. It was a massive bang from downstairs. I wonder what that was. I hope nothing's exploded. We've got the gas engineer in today. But what that means is, so we're looking at this debt. In theory, that debt would be cheaper to service than with the bond yields as they were a few months ago, right? When Trump was doing his monkey business with tariffs. But it's still an increase in overall levels of debt. See, what the Republicans are saying, the ones who tried to pass, well, they did pass the bill. They're saying, and where have we heard this before? Liz Truss. Oh, but the tax cuts will lead to higher growth, so we'll actually end up taking more in taxes by reducing tax rates. That's what they're saying. The extra growth we'll get will compensate for it. But no, it doesn't, because even these congressional estimates say that it's going to lead to $4.5 trillion worth of extra debt over 10 years. Then in terms of the defense thing, that's going to cost an extra $150 billion. Then the border stuff is going to cost an extra $129 billion. And here's where they think they're going to make savings. So nearly $1 trillion in Medicaid cut. But is that going to save them money? Because you can cut it from the budget and say, yeah, well, we won't be spending as much. But what happens to the people then? What happens if, for example, with lost productivity because people are too ill to work and they can't afford, the people who need this Medicaid, they can't afford to get treatment. So they can't work. So you've lost productivity. And at the same time as you're stopping migrants from working in America, that has an economic cost. So it's like, so where does the economic growth come from? You know you're going to have an economic cost to the Medicaid because you're going to lose productivity. You know there's going to be a cost to the so-called savings on green energy because green energy is cheaper. The green energy is cheaper than other forms of energy. And then food benefit, again, that's going to reduce productivity because people are literally going to be starving. You can't be productive if you're going hungry. All of these things come at an economic, although they're classed as savings, Congress has classed them as savings. They're all going to have a knock-on cost later on. And we know that from past experience. Fazilla, they're saying, I work in a UK service company, US owned, exchange rate will mess our bonuses up, etc. Things like that, yeah, that do happen. So that has happened in the past with YouTube as well. Interesting. It does, yeah, things like that happen. If you're paid in dollars, it's not great. So MR, they're saying the Laffer Curve is not applicable as a general principle. As a general principle, it is. It's just what people try and do is they try and infer specific values from it. All the Laffer Curve is, it's a way of saying, look, if you have an income tax, if you charge no taxes, if you have zero taxes, that's unsustainable. You can't grow an economy because the state needs to exist to have a functioning economy, right? So you have to take in taxes from somewhere. But it's also saying you can't apply 100% taxes because then no one makes anything. You know what? No one's going to work for no money. If you're taxed at 100%, you have no money, right? So that can't work either. So all the Laffer Curve says is that somewhere in between 0% and 100%, it basically suggests that there's a point at which taxation will grow the economy, and then there's a tipping point above which it can actually lead to economic losses because you scared away investment. As a general principle, no, that is actually true. The problem with it is Laffer, as I understand it, basically just drew it on a napkin, right? It was just supposed to show a general principle. What you can't do with it is go, oh, that's the value. It doesn't. It just, all it does is demonstrate a general principle. It doesn't tell you what the value is. And in fact, in all honesty, there probably is no way of telling what the value is other than trial and error. And this actually feeds into some of our problems in the UK, because although Reeves isn't being anywhere near as reckless as the Republicans have been with this bill, right? She is under a lot of constraints, because if she doesn't, like when people are talking about some of the way, I think there are some ways in which Reeves has shied away from some extra taxation that she could have applied politically and gotten away with it. But I think, you know, if I'm going to be fair to her, this is the problem, right? If Reeves doesn't, so where are you on that curve, right? If Reeves doesn't tax quite enough, then she's missing out on money she could have, which could have avoided a lot of the mess that's happened to Labour this year, right? But it's like, if you don't quite tax, let's say she could have taxed an extra 10%, just throw out a number out safely. If she could see the future, and she could see a parallel universe where parallel Rachel Reeves applied an extra 10% worth of taxes, predominantly on the rich, and got away with it, it would have worked out, then she's missing out on that, right, by not having done it. But if she goes just slightly over by even 1%, then the whole thing goes to shit. She loses tax. She actually loses money, which means everything is all of a sudden unaffordable, and she can't reverse it. That's the thing. You can slowly edge your way towards slightly higher taxes, and that's the only way to do it, in a way, I suppose, trial and error. Because if you go slightly over, that's Liz Truss territory. I mean, look what's happening in America, right? The Republicans have just put forward a bill that's going to raise the debt, the national debt, by over $3 trillion over 10 years. Now, that is unfunded tax cuts right there, because that's what it's been spent on. Look, it's tax cuts. Look at where the spending is. $150 billion extra on defence, $129 billion extra on borders, $4.5 trillion extra on tax cuts. Some of it says extensions there, because remember, some of these tax cuts are already in place. Trump did them in his first term. They're just due to expire, but some of them are new ones. So it's so these are unfunded tax cuts, and you think to yourself, well, Liz Truss tried to impose unfunded tax cuts, weren't even as big as this, and the bond markets, like the gilt markets we call them in this country, but the UK bond markets just crashed. There was nearly a run on the pound. But there hasn't been a run on the pound with this. It's interesting, isn't it? It just shows America can actually get away with a lot more, which is also why you have to be careful of, oh, we could do this because this other country did it and they got away with it. You have to be careful, but do the same conditions apply? Because America, the American government, has just gotten away with massive unfunded tax cuts. Trump did the same thing before in his first term as well. And although they're saying, but the tax cuts will pay for themselves, they know that's not true, because it's not just that the forecast says that this is going to add trillions of dollars of debt. They know it as well, because they've raised the debt ceiling to allow for it. $5 trillion, correct me if I'm wrong, any ones who follow American politics more closely than I believe they've raised the debt ceiling by $5 trillion to accommodate this. Trump wanted it removing completely. Back in January, or was it December, just before he was inaugurated, he wanted the debt ceiling removed completely. That's what he was planning. Anyway, capital with those. They didn't really edge with the employer national insurance contribution. Basically became the excuse for reduced pay increases. No, they did edge with it. They absolutely edged with it. They had to. They needed a massive amount of tax, and that was the only source of it that would tie in with their manifesto promises. Whether they were the right manifesto promises is another matter. I would have liked, for me, and again, I don't know that this would, you don't know. But for me, I would have preferred it if they'd have said, after the Tories reduced national insurance, employees' national insurance contributions, I'd have preferred it if they'd have said, look, we can't afford this. This is a pre-election bribe that is unsustainable, and whoever's in power afterwards is going to have to put it back up. I'd have cited the case of 1992, when the Conservatives lowered taxes before the election of 1992 and then put them straight back up again in 1992 after the election. They didn't even wait till the next year. They were straight back up again, right? If I were Labour, I'd have liked to try that ploy. Said, look, we are going to put them back because these are unaffordable, but we will not further increase national insurance. So I'd have basically said, into the general election, we will not increase income tax, national insurance or VAT above the levels they were at the start of 2024. I think that probably would have been fine. So that's what they should have done. However, given that they didn't do that, And given that, the black hole is real, by the way, when people go, oh, Reeves goes on about this black hole, there's no evidence it exists. It's like the OBR published a report on it. They actually published it, if I'm going to find it again. Hang on a minute. Oh, I'd have to find it again. It's not easy now. I'm just getting into the budget. But alongside their assessment of the budget, they produced another... Oh, is this it? They produced an extra report specifically on the March one. They updated it. But anyway. Right, let's go through some comments there. On a hypothetical, would the rich being rich be as much of an issue if they actually spent the majority of their money on goods, services, or is the situation we're in basically? It wouldn't be anywhere near as big an issue, no. So if you're talking... So there's two problems with the insane levels of wealth we have these days. The first is that wealth is not being used. Like, you want money cycling around the economy, otherwise it might as well not be there. It's a bit like, in terms that people understand. If you lose some money down the back of the sofa and it just stays there for years and years and years, it's not useful. It's not useful to you because you don't necessarily know it's there. It's not useful. It's a problem. The Bank of England has a problem with it because they know there are notes not actually in circulation, but at the same time they are, because you could dig them out the back of the safe at any time. And if they're not still legal tender, you could still take them to a bank and get your money, right? So they have to account for it. But it's not being used. It's not being usefully used. And that's what rich people are doing by either sending it offshore. We have to accept some money leaving the country if it's on trade, if we're buying imports, because we know we're also selling exports, right? But if it's just going to a tax haven, it's not doing anything. It's not doing anything for them. It's not doing anything for us. So that is a huge problem because it's not cycling around the economy. Just to give you a clear example, £1,000, right? Give £1,000 to someone who's very wealthy. What do? Throw it on the pile. If you're lucky, maybe they'll spend it on their investment fund because then at least it's doing something. So if you put it in an investment fund, it's at least doing something. But if you just throw it somewhere, it's doing nothing. Then that £1,000, the Treasury never sees it again. But if you give £1,000 to someone on minimum wage, they're going to spend it, right? Now, what are they going to spend it on? They may spend it, maybe they're struggling with food, so they're going to spend it on more food. The money they spend on food, that shop is then making more profit, so those profits will be taxed. So some money goes back to the Treasury. Some of that food will be liable for VAT. So some of that goes straight back to the, Treasury as well. That shop employs people. So those employees, there's national insurance, employees and employers, and income tax. That goes back to the Treasury. So that £1,000 all of it eventually goes back to the Treasury because all tax and spend policies from the government is cycling money around, really. Whereas and this is why when we talk about the economy, does the economy grow or it shrink? The reason why it's shrunk in real terms while the Tories were in power is because the Tories allowed a lot of that money, instead of being usefully used, to just rot on a pile. That's why our economy shrunk. Whereas if you use money, if you tax money and then you spend it on things that are going to cycle it around, then your economy will grow. I mean, it's not as simple as that. There are other things that are needed for your economy to grow as well. But, I mean, just to give you a little example, I was talking about earlier this week. So it's been calculated. I'm trying to remember who did it now. Someone calculated, it may have been The Guardian actually, they got someone to calculate that the NHS is spending every year about £50 billion on treating people due to the effects of poverty. So lots of things related to poverty causing illnesses, which the government accept. Liz Truss has said this week, yes, there is absolutely a link between poverty and ill health. Mental health, physical health, right? So that it's calculated that the NHS are spending £50 billion a year specifically due to illnesses basically created or exacerbated by poverty. Now, there are 12 million people in absolute poverty in the UK. So there's relative and absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is like, for me, the measure of poverty. There's always going to be relative poverty, right? You can be all right, you can be fine, and be in relative poverty. So absolute poverty, 12 million. That's still a ridiculous number for a 68 million population country that's like one of the richest in the world. For 12 million people, that's nearly a fifth, are in absolute poverty. That means they cannot actually afford what we would consider the basics. If you were to spend £50 billion a year just by giving anyone in absolute poverty, anyone considering absolute poverty, got a certain amount of money from the government, just as like a UBI, but it's not universal because it only applies to people below a certain amount, but a grant for people with incomes below a certain amount. Every man, woman and child got this money. That would amount to £4,000, right? Just over £4,000. So a household with 2 parents and 2 kids would get an extra £16,000. Now, a household in absolute poverty getting £16,000 from the government, like, spend it on what you like, £16,000, here you go, no tax, done, right? They wouldn't be in absolute poverty anymore, would they? £16,000 would absolutely cover those basics on top of what they're already getting, yeah? And then the NHS wouldn't have to be spending that 50 billion. So you could think to yourself, well, let's just do that then. Let's just spend this 50 billion. We'll just, anyone below a certain level that's considered absolute poverty, we'll just give them this grant and then no longer in absolute poverty. Probably on a sliding scale, so you didn't have this cliff edge, because that causes problems. But the NHS couldn't instantly save that 50 billion over years. So you'd need to do it in parallel. But that is what we need to do. If you want to stop the NHS spending tens of billions of extra in future years, it's quite clear you could save £50 billion a year by not having absolute poverty. Just don't have absolute poverty. But that would mean you would need an amount of money in the tens of billions a year to be able to just basically have a sort of restricted level of, not universal basic income, because it wouldn't be universal, but a basic income for people on below certain levels of income. Eliminate absolute poverty. Eliminate the level of poverty that causes illnesses and loss of productivity. Your economy would grow. They'd be more productive, fitter, healthier, more productive. Your economy would grow. The NHS wouldn't be as stretched. But where to get the money from? You'd have to tax the rich. And how to do that? If Rachel Reeves has already taxed the rich by quite a bit, but she can't do another 50 billion because that, in a year, and this would be 50 billion a year, by the way, 50 billion a year. So over the course of an election cycle, it'd be like a quarter of a trillion pounds. And this is your problem. But the rich could afford to do it. It's just that they won't do it. So it's a massive problem. The fact that people have been allowed to get so wealthy. There are so many other problems that derive from it as well. You've got people who are rich enough to influence elections. Elon Musk won that election for Donald Trump last year. I mean, Trump, yeah, he played. I'm not saying Trump, but Trump wouldn't have won without Musk's support. Elon Musk used his wealth to buy a social media platform. It wasn't a commercial venture. He used his wealth to buy a social media platform, as well as pumping in. People talk about the money he actually pumped into Trump's campaign. That was peanuts, absolute peanuts. It was buying Twitter. The fact that he could do that, having people that are rich enough to do that, that is a side problem as well. So there's so many problems here. Derek, they're saying the £1,000 typically making money for banks and bankers as if they're short of money. Well, the thing is, though, I mean, that is the system we have. And there's no way, so what you're talking about is the failings of capitalism. I would prefer it if basically governments, right, if every nation, the government basically owned its own nation and ran things. Like, I am sort of someone who, I'm basically a communist that understands that people don't want communism, so I compromise. That's how I would probably describe myself. I know communism won't work. It doesn't work because it doesn't tie in with people's beliefs. People do want to own their own home. They want the security of owning their own home. ownership is on a certain level fine. You can live with it, right? I'm not. I would still prefer it if the state just assigned housing, but people want to buy things, right? That's fine. The problem comes when people can buy elections, when individual people can buy elections and buy governments. That's when you've got a problem. So there's lots of reasons why we should not have billionaires. When people say there should be no such thing as billionaires, it can have multiple meanings. It can mean that our tax policies should never allow anyone to be able to gather that much money because it's not possible for someone to be that productive. But it can also mean other things, that people can then use that wealth to have excessive influence on the direction of an entire country. And there are some billionaires who, yes, you can describe as philanthropists, right? Bill Gates, you know, he is a philanthropist. You may not agree with the way he spends his money all the time, but he does spend it on good causes. But the fact that most billionaires will use their wealth specifically to help them become more billionaire at the cost of others. And this right here is a perfect example of it. $4.5 trillion worth of tax cuts, predominantly for the wealthy, tax cuts. And they're not balancing the books on it. It's going to require debt, trillions of dollars of debt. But because they weren't allowed to fund it entirely from debt, they had to cut something from the budget. What have they cut? Medicaid, green energy, food benefits. So ordinary Americans are going to suffer. They're not only going to have to service the debt, or poorer Americans are going to have to do without medical care and in some cases food. All Americans are going to suffer from not having, you know, a green energy industry advancing as quickly as it could. All people around the world, quite frankly, are going to suffer from that. And for what? Tax cuts for people who do not need tax cuts, who actually should be taxed more. And what we actually need, you know, you need an international movement on this, because if an individual country raises its tax rate, you can get away with a little bit. If you do it too much, then there is a point at which, because people can say, oh, but people don't move like that, they don't move in such numbers. No, that's true. If someone do you know what? If a rich person wants to live in the UK, they want to live in the UK. If you tax them more, they're not necessarily going to move because you've taxed them a bit. Some people do, not many, right? But they can still move their money. That's what people need to focus on. You know, they'll use as the counter, oh, but these people won't actually leave in large numbers. It's like, no, they might not, but they will move their money. It's quite easy when you're rich to move your money. Jacob Rees-Mogg moved his money, didn't he? With Brexit, when he knew Brexit was coming, he moved his money to the EU because it wasn't going to be safe in Britain. You know, it's so easy to move your money if you've got that much of it. Like you and I, not so easy, because we get our money from income. We don't have wealth. Well, some of you may do, but I mean, I don't have wealth. So my money comes from income. I don't have any money in the bank that I didn't earn in the last year. Although I have now started to create an investment fund for my retirement, but all of my, you know, so I don't own property and I don't have a bank account with like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions in the bank. I'm not doing anything. If you do, you can move it there. You can't hide income easily. You'd have to, if you want to stop tax on your income, yeah, you're going to have to move. But if you just want to stop tax on your wealth, you just have to move your wealth. Whereas if the whole world got together and said, no, collectively, wealth should be taxed, then we could do a proper wealth tax. So that's why when people talk about a wealth tax, I counter with land tax. Land tax is the only wealth tax the UK can actually apply properly, that won't fail. If you tax wealth that can be moved, people will move it if they don't want to pay the tax. It's really that simple. But land can't be moved. Can't be moved. If you own half of Hertfordshire, right, the government can say, well, you're going to pay the tax on it. And it's like, well, I'll just move it. Where are you going to move it? Let's see, that'll be a good laugh. If we could move land, then I would be in favour of moving most of Essex to somewhere else entirely, right? but it's not actually realistic. Anyway, coming to the end, let's go through a few last little comments. Ordinary Americans earning in excess of $4 million a year get a benefit from the system, even if they have their Medicare and Medicaid cut. Yeah, all of this is essentially, it's tax cuts for the rich. That's all it is. Naked tax cuts for the rich. It's not even like a tax cut for the rich. It's not like, the government have got a surplus and they go, okay, well, let's do some tax cuts. And then they just give those tax cuts to the rich. These are tax cuts for the rich that are going to be paid for, not because tax revenues are higher than expected, but because they're going to increase debt and they're going to take away vital infrastructure, healthcare, green energy, food, for goodness sake. Vince, Farage would move Clacton to America. He would have my blessing to do so. If he can squeeze it either across the top of Scotland or underneath England and get it across the Atlantic, he would have my blessing to do so. Assets tax. Again, it depends what your asset is. If your asset can be moved, no point in taxing it, right? Land, tax land. Here are your benefits. This is my final one because I've got to get ready for Graham's stream in half an hour. So, benefits of land tax, and top level economists have talked about this as well. Benefits of land tax. One, you can't hide it. You can't hide it. There's land there. Someone owns it. Someone has to own it. The government have a right to know who owns it. Whoever's on the documentation is owning it pays the tax. Second benefit, you can adjust the tax according to its use. So it won't put off investment. Because let's say someone wants to say, well, I want to build a factory in your country, but your land tax, I'm not sure about your land tax. You go, but it's not a problem, mate. Because if you buy land and you build a factory on it and you employ so many people, that's useful to us because we're going to generate taxes from your profits and the incomes of the workers you're supporting. So we will give you a very, very low rate of land tax. You could even be zero. You could actually have zero land tax for certain uses. So commercial uses, as long as it either generates a certain amount of tax, whether as a combination of your employment or your profits or whatever, you can get an exemption on it. It's a bit like, with a company, spend £50, get £5 off. It can be, if you generate a certain amount of tax from profits and, income tax on your employees and stuff, you can have zero land tax, 0% land tax. Other benefits is it means that a lot of useless land can be taxed more. So you can encourage people who own land to use it, not just keep it vacant, derelict. It's like, that's not used. Have a tax that's basically inversely proportional to its use to society. The more useful the use of that land is to society, the less it pays. The more useless it is, the more it pays. So you can have low tax for farmers using it to grow food, or even just rewilding if it's considered environmentally useful, right? Low tax. If it's just a derelict site that's not even like providing wildlife or anything, it's just like it's concreted over, there's nothing on it, high tax. Stuff like that. But anyway, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of day and evening. Tomorrow I will be very much onto Labour's first year in power. So I'm hoping to get a video out for that, although I've recorded it, but I've still got to do it. It's gonna be a bit of a rush job. And tomorrow's stream will be on that as well, if it lets me stream this time. But have a great day, and until next time, I'll see you later.